On behalf of the conference organizers, Atia Ahmed, Salma Shahata, Kelly Shannon, Shana Marshall, and myself, good morning and welcome to the 18th annual conference of the Institute for Middle East Studies. I'm Mona Ataya. I direct the Institute for Middle East Studies. I'm Associate Professor of Geography and International Affairs here at the Elliott School. And I just wanted to introduce you to the Institute for Middle East Studies, whose mission is to foster a vibrant intellectual community through facilitating research and dialogue on the modern Middle East, supporting faculty and graduate students in all departments of the university whose interests focus on the region, and supporting educational programs, including the BA and MA degree. And it's through our public programming based on informed scholarship that IMIS cultivates a deeper understanding and appreciation of the events, ideas, and cultures of the region in order to produce a better informed public. It's moments like this that underscore the importance of this mission and our collective responsibility in advancing it. First, I'd like to acknowledge that GW is located on land tended by Anacostan and Piscataway people. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal of Indigenous people from this territory, and that these nations ceded significant portions of their land in inequitable and unfair treaties with the US government. We recognize and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond, but addressing historical injustices does not end with this acknowledgement, but with an ongoing commitment and the work that involves all of us. In addition to a renewed need to commit to this work, we are also witnessing an unprecedented assault on academic freedom. While we largely constituted this conference as an in-person gathering, I'd like to acknowledge the fear, intimidation, and blatant violation of rights that is targeting non-US citizens and making them think twice about getting on a plane. So we gather here today demonstrating the vital importance and commitment to academic freedom, to hear from researchers doing critically important work, and to increase public understanding of a largely misunderstood region. The title of the conference is Gravitating Towards the Gulf. As the centers of gravity are shifting and a new world order is in the process of becoming, the Gulf has warranted much more serious scholarly attention. While the contested Persian Arabian Gulf has not historically been a major area of research within Middle East studies, attention to the region has increased dramatically in recent years. With that attention has emerged fascinating research questions about how the Gulf has globalized, its regional significance, and changing spheres of. As you can see in the program, we have three panels planned for today. The first on the many faces of Gulf cultural diplomacy, the second on constructing the future, placemaking, infrastructure, and technology, and the last panel on the geopolitics of the Gulf and the world. Each presenter will speak for 12 minutes, then the discussant will offer reflections and a first round of questions, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A from the audience. For the Q&A portion, we have adapted a process initiated by Eve Tuck, Professor of Indigenous Studies at NYU, as a way to be more deliberate and thoughtfully engage with one another. So the first 5 minutes of the Q&A, we will ask you to pause and turn to the person sitting next to you and peer review your question. This is to ensure that the question is a question and not a statement or a personal anecdote, and to ensure that we are not asking the speaker to do something beyond their capacity or outside the purview of their topic expertise. We found out last year that this generates a productive opening for discussion. And for those of you online, IMIS Assistant Director Christian Clinton will be feeding your questions through the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And on that note, we have to thank the IMIS staff, in particular Christian Clinton, who makes everything happen magically behind the scenes. So thank you, Christian, for all your dedication, hard work, and amazing competence. Thank you, Shana Marshall, also for your amazing work and dedication to the Institute. And of course, our work study students, Ellie, Matthew, Noha, all helping out today. Thank you so much for all your hard work. So we're going to begin our conference with a keynote lecture by Dr. Arang Keshavarzian, and his recent book, Making Space for the Gulf, which reveals how capitalism, empire building, geopolitics, and urbanism have each shaped understandings of the region over the last 2 centuries. His work reveals how the Gulf has been globalized through transnational relations, regionalized as a geopolitical category, and cleaved along national divisions and social inequities. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming to the floor Dr. Keshavarzian.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by thanking all the organizers. This is a wonderful curated conference. It's an honor to be part of it and help start the discussions. Let me also thank Christian for his attention to detail and communication at every turn. A very well-organized event. I can't say it about all events, but this one definitely was. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about my book, in part because not only am I among many good friends and students, but also part of a good portion of this book was actually written here in Washington, D.C. Before and even during COVID, the beginnings of COVID. So it's nice to come back here and now that the book has been out for a little while to share it with all of you. So what I'm going to do is I've been told to try to keep my comments to 40 minutes, and I will try to keep it even to 35 if possible. I'll give a kind of an overview of the book. I'm not assuming anyone has read it, but I'll try to give an overview of some of the themes and lines of argumentation. But in the second part, the end of the talk, I'm trying to do something a little bit different, partly because of the themes of the conference being on the Gulf and the wonderful expertise in the room. So I'm going to try to think about if there is something called critical Gulf studies, if that exists, and share some thoughts along those lines. Okay, so my book examines the Persian Gulf and considers what it means for this body of water to be turned into a distinct geographical region. To think about this, not only did I have to contend with very rich and varied histories of port cities, commodities, peoples who have settled or circulated through the Gulf and the adjacent lands, but I had to think anew about geography, space, and place. I had to move away from thinking about regions as enclosed entities and geographies as timeless structures, and space as merely a passive stage on which actions take place. Instead, I hope I've been able to convince the reader of Making Space for the Gulf that it is constructive to think of the Persian Gulf, and all places, in fact, as dynamic, social, and unbounded, or to adopt the late British geographer Doreen Massey's term, I call for an extroverted sense of place. In other words, the book pushes against geographical determinism and the abstraction of the Gulf region from society. And it does this through a relational understanding of space. One way to see the utility of this approach is to think about a tension or a paradox that in fact motivated me to sit down and write this book in the first place. The Gulf is at once concrete and highly elusive. I use this. In many ways, the Persian Gulf is something that is highly tangible and specific. There are at least three different ways that this happens: cartographically, epistemologically, and in terms of cultural exceptionalism. First, we can, and I think people in this room all can, locate it on a map. We can identify cities, ports, and social communities that live on its shores and depend on the life worlds that are sustained by the body of water. Modern cartographers and geopoliticians, many of them in the city right here, have come to readily take a bird's eye view, or if you will, a God's eye view of the Gulf, turning it into an abstract space with clear measurements. As a two-dimensional object, this aerial perspective invites us all to capture it, to possess it, and to guard it. Moreover, in the past 20 to 30 years, the blossoming literature that Mona just referenced, an increasing number of conferences, books, associations, and journals have been dedicated to the study and knowledge production about the Gulf. And more students want to take courses on this topic. When I first became a professor about 20 years ago, no student was interested in a course on the Gulf, but now it's actually quite hard to keep them out of the classroom or wanting to talk and write papers about the Gulf. Governments, think tanks, universities, PR firms, and others have invested in the idea of Gulf cities, Gulf culture and Gulf studies, and present it as somehow distinct from other places, including the rest of the Middle East, something we can probably talk about later today. Thirdly, there is a strong tendency for the knowledge produced about the Gulf to emphasize the particular, singular, and even parochial character of the people, geology, and culture of the Persian Gulf. Too often, in trying to define and make the Gulf into a distinct social system or a vivid cultural unit, we end up making it specific by essentializing it and turning it into a monolithic whole. On the other hand, the Gulf is also obscure, vague, and contested. There is no consensus as to what is inside or outside of it. Pick up a book on the so-called Gulf, and you're never quite sure what will be included. Will Iraq feature in the book? Will Yemen? Will Pakistan? Will India? Or in fact, will Iran be included? Second, for some, the Gulf is a sea that has functioned for centuries as a transmission belt facilitating the flow, quote unquote, of people, commodities, and ideas. For others, it's a sub-region of the Middle East or the Arab world. Yet for others, the Gulf is a border, a boundary between states, separating distinct civilizations. And at other moments, or for other interested parties, the Gulf is a frontier zone with empires colliding and wealth being extracted from bountiful energy sources and immense stores of surplus capital. Also a place where we can experiment with and think about fanciful and cutting-edge technologies and projects that we'll hear about in a short while. And if the Gulf is all of these things, how and why can they sit side by side? Rather than trying to adjudicate which understanding of the Persian Gulf is more accurate or more true, in the book, I try to make sense of how these different conceptions of and aspirations for the Gulf have emerged across time and from different vantage points. These realized as well as incomplete projects shed light on how knowledge is produced about these societies and leads to different policies and material consequences, ranging from who is invited to a particular conference or which countries are allowed to be members of one international organization or another, for instance. But I also examine Gulf regionalism to ponder what it reveals to us about the Gulf's relationships to other places, social processes, and political projects, ranging from imperialism, nationalism, and capital extraction and accumulation. In other words, I'm interested in the tensions and contradictions indexed by the multiplicity of meanings and conceptions of the Gulf. It is for this reason that the book builds on a rich tradition in human geography and critical geopolitical studies and thinks of the Persian Gulf as a process rather than an object or abstract space. I adopt a relational approach to space to argue the space is thoroughly social. Humans, ranging from capitalist firms to migrant laborers, make and continuously remake and give meaning to space. As such, geography does not determine social outcomes. By approaching space as not existing prior to history, society, and politics, then we are compelled to think of regionalism as an outcome rather than something that can be assumed or treated as a given or something that exists outside of society or exists apolitically. Making Space for the Gulf narrates the histories of disparate regional projects that are animated by a complex mixture of structural conditions, contingencies, and unrealized aspirations. And once we adopt this process-driven and relational approach to space, I contend not only does the Gulf appear as multiple and constructed, but also the regional scale itself can be approached as a geographic scale that intersects and constitutes other spatial politics and scales. For instance, the urban, the national, imperial, the international, the global, and so forth. This allows us to see movement alongside of immobility, happening simultaneously, that is. Allows us to think about commodification alongside of dispossession. We were forced to think of connectivity as well as border making, and to treat the Gulf as fundamentally uneven, variegated, and differentiated. Importantly, it requires us to think of borders as porous, and I'll get back to that towards the end of the talk, and think in terms of space and time together, or just think of space-time. Now, I selected this painting. It's a 1958 painting by Hushang Pezeshkian, an Iranian painter who spent much time in the southwestern province of Khuzestan, bordering Iraq and the northern parts of the Gulf. But I wanted this painting on the cover of the book because it seems to me to be an evocative attempt to present or represent the Gulf, including seafarers and fishermen, through a series of layered abstractions. That is, as a collective that constitutes the Gulf landscape. This captures what I'm trying to do within the book itself. I'm emphasizing the multiplicity and the incommensurability of projects, circulations, and lives that require diverse perspectives to fully grasp the Gulf itself. Alas, the publisher, wonderful publisher and editor, nonetheless decided not to use the entire painting, so I leave it here for you to maybe enjoy, because the image on the book is cropped like all of us experience, all of us who have published books experience. As for the book itself, the book is designed to emphasize all of these conceptual points, with the narrative being organized in a non-chronological, or if you will, non-teleological fashion. Instead, I organized the book in terms of geographic scale, from the imperial to the nation state, to the scale of the subnational free trade zone, and then finally to the urban. The conclusion itself distills these threads at the human scale, where I discuss some personal experiences in the Gulf itself. This all allows me to emphasize simultaneity and how region making intersects with and is recruited for other types of spatialized politics. So the chapters work recursively with certain historical moments, such as the 1979 revolution, or the oil boom of the 1970s, or various other kind of political junctures, appearing multiple times, appearing in more than one chapter. And the narratives within these chapters sort of fold in on themselves. And that's what I hope, the kind of layering that it comes across to the reader. After the introduction of the book, I begin by examining the social, economic, and political forces at play at the cusp of the 19th century. I emphasize the role of ecology and the overlapping and cross-cutting nature of political power, as well as socioeconomic interdependence. Focusing on date and pearl trade, as well as circular migration across the waters of the Gulf, the chapter shows how the Gulf was geographically unbounded and socially interdependent, despite and because of social hierarchies, economic inequalities, and cultural creolization and hybridization. It maps out how sea-facing people were bound together through necessity and obligation, as well as coercion and exploitation. Chapter 2 looks at regionalism from the imperial scale. The chapter investigates how this unbounded regionalism was overwritten by an aspiration to turn it into an enclosed and externally secured geopolitical zone, first by the British Empire, and then through US hegemony and military primacy. As a diverse coalition of actors, from geopolitical thinkers to British Indian map makers to investors in telegraph lines and steamships, came to see the Gulf as a critical imperial frontier and zone for profit making, they convinced policymakers back in London that the fate of the British Empire hinged on this new zone that initially was called the Middle East. And the Middle East, the concept expands further north and west. Consequently, the Gulf was transformed into a quote unquote empty terrain and an abstract space that needed protection from the outside, quote unquote. First, the British Navy provided this, and then the US Central Command. The chapter moves from the mid-1800s to the early 2000s, following a pendulum swing from British maritime investments in coal depots, ports, and remote islands to the building of protected states tied down by treaties and extractive concessionary agreements, to a post-independence era of clientist nation states caught up in the Cold War. But after the 1970s, there's been a somewhat curious shift back to logistics hubs and transportation corridors as spatial articulation of global power. Has become something that is sometimes described as America's pointillist empire, made up of 700 bases and across 80 countries. So for me, in a sense, we are back in some ways to the world of the 19th century. Divided Sovereignties, or Chapter 3, turns to the late 19th century, but does so to examine how projects to build independent states intersected with imperial formations and extractive capitalism, oil industries, of course. In this era, imperialism morphed into internationalism, and state building carried with it new notions of the Gulf as a boundary. The bordering process included regimes of mobility that dictated how people, now by the mid-20th century, classified as subjects, citizens, nationals, foreigners, migrants, and sometimes national threats, could or could not move across a region that was shot through by state boundaries, racial markers, class distinctions, and political coalitions. Chapter 4 explores regionalism and its conflictual place in the world of states and as well as global capitalism. I examined the genealogy of free trade zones, in particular two of them, Kish Island off of Iran and Jebel Ali on the border of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, to both critique conventional understandings of globalism as making the world flat, and to historicize anew our narratives of neoliberalism, in a sense, pushing the genealogy further back than our standard story of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This chapter focuses on the history of these free trade zones as a way to think about how spatial politics found expression in the subnational scale of the zone and the supranational imaginaries of the Gulf as a scene for globalization. The fifth chapter is titled Urbanism Rebounded, and it asks what it means for the Gulf cities to be global cities, and what sorts of understandings of regionalism and globalism are evoked in the building of these cities themselves. This chapter studies the shift from port cities to mid-20th century nationalizing modernist projects to globalizing cities of the past quarter century. I argue that urban morphology and the very production of cities, or production of space, if you want to generalize it, have always been translocal or spill out beyond city boundaries. And these processes have always been dependent on long-distance assemblages to build infrastructure, feed city dwellers, recruit labor, and produce society through paid and unpaid labor of women, men, girls, and boys. As such, urbanism is a lens to detect and decipher how regionalism as well as globalism are expressed and constituted at the built environment, or through the built environment. I conclude the book by foregrounding the human scale and how it reveals the ways in which social intercourse is made possible by regionalism, and illustrates the conflicts, erasures, and the incompleteness of different regionalizing projects. Now, let me change gears for this last part of the talk. On the one hand, I hope the points that I've just laid out are somewhat compelling. But given the audience we have today in the room and online, I also hope that the talk or the ideas within the talk resonate with many of you and resonate with the way you understand ways to approach the Gulf in general. I say this because my thinking about the Gulf has been fundamentally shaped by many of you sitting right here or online, I believe. Your excellent scholarship, and in some cases, your generous interactions with my writings in recent years have been immensely helpful. More broadly, however, I have come to think of my work as a product of, and possibly, hopefully, a contributor to what I'm going to be calling critical Gulf studies. In the past decade or two, there's been a growing and diverse array of researchers departing from older, and I'm going to call it policy-oriented scholarship that centered the study of the Persian Gulf on a relatively narrow set of concepts: the rentier state, sultanism or paternalism, tribes, and a set of stark binaries: tradition versus modernity, Arab versus Iranian, monarchies versus revolutionary regimes, nationals versus foreigners. And finally, the scholarship has tended to adopt an epochal approach to history rather than a historicizing one. An epochal approach to history that was predicated on very stark ruptures, notably the pre and post oil eras or the pre and post oil boom eras. In many of these tellings, despite or because of the wealth of the region, the Gulf, this monolithic whole, is viewed as forever catching up with the rest of the world and for somehow being stuck in some sort of lower stage of a singular developmental trajectory. The approach I'm dubbing critical Gulf studies challenges all this and encompasses research across a number of different disciplines. I'm talking about historians, anthropologists, political economists, geographers, and many others. It includes scholarship on discrete countries, cities, social classes, transnational configurations, such as oceanic approaches or migration routes and circulations. I'm going to avoid naming names because invariably I'm going to say the wrong name and someone's going to get upset that I didn't mention this person or that person. We can have that discussion if you like, but I'm not going to do the listing of names. And let me be clear, I don't want to imply that this is a unified or conscious school of thought. I suspect many of the people I have in my mind would be offended by this very concept that there is something called critical Gulf studies. And I'm open to all of your criticisms. In fact, my sense is that while some of these folks read one another, are oftentimes on panels together, appear even in the same edited books, and even are members of the same WhatsApp chat groups, disciplinary, generational, linguistic, and snarky academic attitudes oftentimes keep them apart. I said it. Nonetheless, what I see in their work, and maybe your work, is a tendency not to approach the Gulf as a monolith, and to take categories such as the nation, global, migrant, rent, class, tribe, smuggler as given, or let alone stable. Critical Gulf studies asks questions such as, how are workers transformed or made into migrants and privileged nationals? How do oil rents circulate and help create particular sets of class relations and conglomerations both within the Gulf as well beyond it or outside of it? Or why do particular conceptions of authenticity and modern authenticity why do particular conceptions of authenticity and modernity or developmentalism animate social discourse and state visions and not other interpretations? In posing these and many other sorts of questions, scholars draw connections to various places and unearth forgotten histories, sometimes forgotten archives. The main thrust of this work is to de-exceptionalize the Gulf, and I think many people in this room are well aware of a wonderful recent book by Ahmed Khanna, Emile Renard, and Neha Vora, Beyond Exceptionalism, that does a very nice job discussing the problems of the exceptionalizing of the Gulf. The Gulf is what I want to contend, or what this school of thought wants to contend, is that the Gulf is dialogically situated in relationship to histories of capitalism, histories of empire, histories of race, developmentalism, the Cold War, and much more. And while theories developed in other contexts are shown to be applicable to various projects on the Gulf, it is also assumed that working on the Gulf will help us illuminate understandings of other places beyond the Gulf itself. So it can be a producer of theory or knowledge, not just a consumer of it. Let me end by discussing three final points or propositions that I think runs through much of the work that I'm calling critical Gulf studies, and that in the year since my book was published, I have come to find extremely generative in the discussions that I've had. Much of this work, of this critical work, adopts a society-centered or bottom-up approach to narrating modern Gulf studies. These are rich histories, including, for instance, Laura Goffman's recent book on disease and medicine in Eastern Arabia, that force us to grapple with various social groups that we oftentimes simply ignore or absent from our stories about the Gulf. I'm talking, of course, about laborers, merchants, but also nurses, pregnant women, oil executives, nomadic peoples, Persianized Arabs, Arabized Persians, and many others. And they use, these historians and scholars, they use these tactics to use these figures to force us to think about how these actors compel rulers, colonial administrators, and private firms to adopt certain policies or not enforce others. These social histories become critical for me in a few specific ways that I want to flag here. The drawing of state boundaries are enormously consequential, and that's one of the themes of my book. They define the territory of states in the 20th century and regulate movements of people as well as commodities across borders. In many cases, bordering has implications for who can or cannot become a citizen, and it has implications for who has access to subsoil riches as well. And hence, private actors such as oil firms, or squabbling over the border between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for instance, are involved in these bordering processes. It's not just a state-to-state level of discussions. But critical Gulf studies reminds us that bordering does not end at the level of the nation state or at the edge of nation state territories. The border between citizen and non-citizen, the category of unskilled and skilled migrants, of domestic workers and so-called bachelors, and the distinction between labor and social reproduction, between firms in free trade zones and those on the mainland, are all profoundly consequential. They reflect past struggles, but also index current political inequalities. Hence, borders are not just at the edge of states, but run through society in many complex ways. Yet, borders are never simply impenetrable walls. Borders are meeting points and a connective tissue that can nurture hybridity and commingling as much as difference and separation. Critical Gulf studies are very adept at showing that borders are better thought of as membranes that are porous and engineer regimes of mobility as well as immobility, of inclusion as well as exclusion. This is the way to think about the development of the sponsorship or kafala system as being coupled with definitions of citizenship and property ownership, and consider discussions about authenticity or heritage, racialized nationalism, and anxieties about demographic imbalances at the same time as thinking about globalism and creating spaces for global capitalism. These are all systems to define the inside and the outside, and that regulate movements across boundaries, whether they are economic, political, or cultural. Finally, rather than presenting Gulf history as a series of ruptures, from British rule to independence, from seafaring to oil, from the pre-1970s oil boom to the post-boom years, in my reading, critical Gulf studies seeks to historicize and trace processes to map continuities alongside of changes. Thus, older forms never fully disappear. Older imperial formations, expressions of distinction, and economic practices such as bonded labor or patron-client relations can and do persist, and in fact coexist and maybe even buttress newer developments. This is what I mean by thinking of history as layered and sedimented, rather than linear or evolutionary. In making space for the Gulf, I treat geography as an archive, or geographies as archives, because oftentimes history is lazy or history lingers. This does not mean that history repeats itself or necessarily even rhymes, as the expression goes. But the past matters and continues to shape people's lives as well as their political horizons. In conclusion, we should think of the Gulf, like all places, as multiple and plural, rather than a single homogeneous unit or a location on the map. The implication is that no single image or actor can represent this diversity. And when we try to do that by focusing on just a single image of a city, organization, or person, we miss a lot. But just because the Persian Gulf does have multiple and shifting meanings, or there is no consensus as to what is inside or outside of it, it does not mean that we should not try to think about the concept of the Gulf. For the way we approach the Gulf says a lot about how we organize and produce knowledge or articulate aspirations for the future world. It also has concrete outcomes ranging from what states are invited to become members of one organization or another, to what topics and scholars are or are not included in academic conferences, such as the one today. Thank you.
So I guess, okay, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you can look at the emergence of critical Gulf studies as a coming of age of Gulf studies, because this kind of like mirrors what happened in other sub fields within Middle Eastern studies. So my question, which is, I guess, a bit of a professional question, like having been a provost and so on and so forth, is where do you think you can situate Gulf studies best from an institutional point of view? So should it be within sort of like Middle East centers, which are in themselves a bit problematic and sort of like a result from a, like, you know, a tradition we all know was linked to sort of like policy relevance, to say the least? Or is it better to sort of these scholars to sort of stay in their own department and be linked by a program which is sort of not as institutionalized as a Middle East center? So this is my question.
A fair question, not only for provosts. I'm I'll respond as I think, not only how I would respond, but I think what I'm calling critical Gulf studies folks would respond. I think the general thrust would be that, in fact, a center or even a department or program that's Gulf studies would be almost anthema to the project itself, right? If I'm correct that there is a consensus that we approach the Gulf as unbounded, as that must be historicized, then the argument would be that the study of Gulf could be placed in any and all, and should be placed in any and all disciplines, from I don't know, environmental studies to history to anthropology to political science and so forth. So rather than actually encouraging Gulf studies within your university by creating a specialized center where just Gulf people only talk to Gulf people, my sense is that the folks that I'm imagining, they really want to be talking. They do want to talk to each other, but they want to really be talking to people outside. They want to be talking to people who work on, let's call it, the Indian Ocean world, want to talk about the concepts of capitalism or racism, to think about oil production in Venezuela and sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. So they are a curious curious group, right? So that would be my, if I was going to talk to, if I had a meeting with a provost, I would say, no, don't create a Gulf Studies Center, but do invest in Gulf Studies because it is an interesting and dynamic field of study. which are actually asking fundamental questions that are relevant to all of us. The question of deportation that we've all been thinking about this past 3 months is integral to the study of the Gulf, all different, what I'm calling the Gulf. The issue of who gets deported, when, why, under what reasons. The question of circulations of capital and investments in AI and cloud technology that many folks in Gulf studies are working. We're obviously having these discussions in the US last night, whether it comes to teaching or you pick up the news post today. Someone said that medicine, doctors and teachers are going to become irrelevant because AI is going to replace them. Anyway, so these are all fundamental questions that folks who are working in critical Gulf studies have been asking and contemplating now for well over a decade. That would be my response.
Okay. My question is about the critical Gulf studies. And given your engagement with critical human geography, and obviously critical in that context has a very particular meaning, I'm wondering if you are drawing on that in your framing, or sort of how theoretically you're envisioning word critical to play out in this field.
Okay, so as a self-taught geographer and not a professional one, if I understand it correctly, I mean, what I took away from critical geopolitics or critical human geography is this emphasis on the social and approaching geography as continuously being made and reproduced and not being static. And for me, that is consistent with what I'm calling critical Gulf studies, because one of the themes of the scholarship is to push against this notion of that it's inevitable for these countries to be monarchies, or these countries to be to have a very stark divide between citizen and non-citizen, and so on and so forth. It's inevitable that these countries will be allied with the US at this juncture and so forth. And to actually continuously ask, well, how does this happen? Why does this happen? What are the political coalitions that make the building of Palm Islands reasonable, sensible, profitable? And so what makes it profitable and so forth? So for me, that's what's important that's what's critical, is that approaching these the realities in the Gulf is not preordained and not geologically foretold, not culturally defined and so forth, but as a process of social interactions, right? And that's so like the work, like she's not here, I'll talk about it. Laura Goffman's book on disease and medicine in the Gulf. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the title of the book. Is wonderful because she forces us to encounter Saudi nurses and Kuwaiti mothers and people stuck in quarantines stations in first couple decades of the 20th century. And this is, when I was teaching it a few months ago, I mean, the students are like, well, when we think of the Gulf, we never think of these sorts of people. And many of the folks in this room that we're going to hear from later today are going to force us to see or view the Gulf from these perspectives. And once you do, it's not to say that, oh, sheikhs and kings and shahs don't have power. Of course they have power, but they have power vis-a-vis actual concrete social structures, right? Or through these concrete social structures. So it sort of helps demystify these processes. So that's, so again, for me, the critical is the demystification of social relations and forcing us to think about these processes as not inevitable. A lot of this, I think, for people in this room is not that new, but I do encourage you to just stop and read the random op-ed about the Gulf, or even pick up the random books that aren't about the Gulf, but makes, maybe about Egypt or Morocco or Central Asia, and the like simple comments they make about Dubai or, the thing. And that's where you pick up, is that how ingrained this kind of logic is.
So I think my question is at the similar register as this question about critical, but I wanted to ask about exceptionalism. Working in another place that suffers from the burden of exceptionalism, one of the things that strikes me about exceptionalisms is one that each is, it's sort of a generic thing. It causes similar problems, but also each exceptionalism is distinctive, right? That the ways in which these places that are deemed exceptional are have particular configurations that are in some way so. I am starting with a comment, but it will get to a question. That are kind of almost like mirrors of the histories we may be interested in uncovering. Like the specific form of exceptionalism, I think, reveals something. Mm-hmm. So one, I wanted to ask you if you could. I mean, it's sort of consolidating some things that you've already said. If you could say more about what you think is the particular exceptionalism of the Gulf, that is what is figured as its exceptions that make it apart and from other regions, and then what might in that exceptionalism, what is revealed about from a critical perspective about the Gulf from its framing as exceptional in whatever way you see it as being framed.
No, that's a very good question. And it's definitely not in the book. In the book, actually, I don't. It's a long time since I've read the book, but I don't think I actually dwell on the exceptionalism. It's partly I was recently reading that book that I referenced. But yeah, you make a good point. I think, and people in this room are as knowledgeable, if not more than I am. I think actually the Gulf, or the way Gulf studies talks about the Gulf, has shifted the exceptionalism of the Gulf. Up until the 1990s, the Gulf was exceptional, that it was somehow it was a gas station for the world of the world. It was traditional, it's still tribal. These are tribes with flags, all of those. So it's had the very generic Orientalist kind of stereotypes. It was like out of time and out of place with world history, right? So that's why it was exceptional. It was a particularly backward sort of place. So that's how the exceptionalism was articulated. Sometimes, oh, it's exceptional. It's the last bastion of monarchies, right? And there was a lot of work in the 80s and 90s about, why these monarchies survive and cultural characteristics that allow and so on and so forth. Jumping ahead to the 21st century, 2020s, the exceptionalism is sort of morphed into the Gulf is exceptional because it can do certain things that it can, in a sense, escape history. We can build a zero carbon city, Mastar. We can build these green cities in the desert. We can escape history. We can escape climate change. We can escape the problems of capitalism, in fact, because we have these sovereign wealth funds and they make these expert investments and so forth, and we can mobilize entrepreneurial spirit. So your question is interesting because actually it's I didn't make this clear here, that the way we exceptionalize the Gulf changes, and I suspect different audiences exceptionalize it differently. The other comment I would say, within the region, within the broader Middle East region, the Gulf is also exceptional. So for Iranians and South Asians and Egyptians and Syrians, the Gulf becomes this exceptional place. And I think Nora Lori's presentation, if she's online, will talk about that, where you can get this residency and so forth. So maybe it would be a good project to try to map out how these different exceptionalisms are articulated. But again, this emphasis that when we look at this place, we have to grapple with the reality. This is not like France, and this is not like Canada, and this is not like the US, and it's not like India. So it's not like Syria, and it's not like and I think that what I'm calling critical Gulf studies continuously wants to push against that. Not to say that these places aren't different, but to emphasize that these places are connected in the past and in the present to other places. They're not isolated islands. They're not Jazeera in that sense. So that's one of the moves, and the theories that we develop in these places can be applied and they can travel. So it's continuously concerned with the exceptionalization. But grappling with the concrete historical conjunctures that make these places different. So you say all places are different. But yeah, the way the Gulf is exceptionalized is different from Israel, Palestine, and the US, the way US exceptionalizes. That's it.
Fine, this is fantastic. I had a question about how your book has been received, or you had a question about how your book has been received in the Gulf. I mean, it's one thing for us, we're like, I heard you, I'm like, yes, like yes. That's my response. But I'm curious, yeah.
No, that's a fair question. And it's sort of a question for myself. I mean, indications that I have, it's very biased sample, right? Only the people who like the book reach out to you, right? Usually the people who hate the book don't send you an email.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it can happen, but so anecdotally, what I've heard has been quite generous and thoughtful, whether it's been at actual presentations and so forth, and Zoom and so forth. I made a little comment about WhatsApp chat groups. Well, the closure of the WhatsApp chat group is called Critical Gulf Studies. But some of those folks appreciated some of my interventions and so forth. So I've had some positive personal communication about the book. But I'll say two things. One is I haven't received any formal invitation to present it. And I've been to Bahrain, I've been to Qatar, I've been to the Dubai, not the UAE, and not to Abu Dhabi. No one there in those places have invited me. There's a couple of things in the works, but no one has really invited me. What is sort of sad, if I can be switch gears, is Iran. Like when my book on the Bazaar came, I got bombarded with like emails from Iranians and stuff, and it was translated like way too many times and all this kind of stuff. Iranians are completely uninterested in what I've seen. Arash can correct me, but there's a real, and now part of it is like a bunch of them have this nationalist thing. Oh, why did you title it the Gulf, not the Persian Gulf? And I literally on the first sentence or paragraph of this book deals with, but it's actually the lack of interest. Now there are some exceptions, and there's this kind of special issue that I'm part of that we're going to kind of work on this. But it says something in the book. I mean, Iranians have a deeply ambivalent relationship with the Gulf, right? And they've had it for a better part of 100 years almost, right? It's clearly essential to notions of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, colonial incursion, and so forth for very good and real reasons, tangible reasons. But it's also treated as this kind of backwater, underpopulated, vulnerable, ignorant, and it gets racialized because of the former African slaves and so forth. Iranian intellectuals in the 60s had very strange relationships with the South. They were some of the practices in like Czar and so forth, but it's a problematic way. So that's important. I mean, someone told me, Shayla Carapico has commented on Saudi Arabia's similarly ambivalent relationship with the Gulf. It's like on the Gulf, but she's commented on like Saudi likes to think of it on the Red Sea. It also has this somewhat checkered relationship with the Gulf, unlike Arab Gulf states, right?
I guess what I'm interested in, right, is that you're talking about this unbounded,
Sure.
bounded place that becomes bounded in these layers of sovereignty. And I would presume that some people would be sympathetic to that, people who've been crossing these and are for that, and then other people who aren't. So I'm just,
Yeah, I assume that's part of the reason that, so I mean, even 8-9 years ago when I was going to Iran, whenever I would raise these sorts of issues, from good leftists and stuff, they were deeply uncomfortable about talking about provinces, so forth, like Khuzestan and so forth. So it is, it's, that's all I have to say. I would love for someone to write a critique of the book from that perspective. I haven't come across it. Maybe it's in the works.
My commentary question actually kind of goes perfectly from this. So I've written a major review of the book in Persian that will come out soon, and in the Premier Humanities website, sort of for Iranians. So hopefully that I'm not sure it's true that they haven't paid it as much attention as the Bazaar book, perhaps, and I think there are sort of different reasons for that. But I think there would be interest of the book in Iran. For the book in Iran. And the question I had actually sort of relates to this. If I just had, when we say Iranians had an ambivalent relation to Gulf, the Iranians on the Gulf, of course, and so obviously, so I think, in the last few years, for example, the relationships of Iranians, like in Tehran and to Junub, as like the south as a sort of a side of tourism has really changed. So I think it's a very sort of, developing thing like any other context. But I guess my question is, and funny enough, I was very fascinated by your talk because the review that I wrote, I sort of discussed exactly this, that, if this is, what is critical sort of Gulf studies? I might even use sort of the exact term, right? So, because there being a critical Gulf studies sort of kind of assumes there's also a non-critical Gulf studies, right? So I guess my question is, what do you think is the relationship between these critical Gulf studies, much of it scholars like based in the United States, like yourself and others, to those of various forms of scholarships with clear political commitments that are coming out of the literal countries of the Persian Gulf. So not just the GCC members, but Iran and Iraq, right? Iraq is now host to the Arabian Gulf sort of tournaments, Arabian Gulf centers of studies, and Iran, of course, has a very long and rich tradition of Persian Gulf studies, including sort of fulcral, semi-amateurish, right? People who have written like thousands of pages on finding out what flora and fauna is in every corner of the Gulf, and they very clearly they do this as a project of national sovereignty. And I'll just end by saying that I think that's sort of it's interesting, right? So, but basically I'm trying to say that I don't think perhaps you should be all dismissed, and I don't think you're doing that, of course. The sort of nationalist committed historiographers in this region do have a critical lens, in a sense, vis-a-vis, with the fact that there's not a knowledge that is produced in them, so they have a critical lens there, and they're also the relationship between them would be critical to sort of peace in our region now, between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So the very recent diplomatic normalizations between these countries now allows for more conferences to be like Persian Gulf conferences that could be shared between these countries in a way that was impossible 5 years ago.
No, those are important points. So the non-critical Gulf studies that I was evoking was this. I was having a very Anglo-centric kind of intellectual intervention here. And it's not fair. There wasn't much of a Gulf studies before the 1990s, right? There were very few people who were actually concertedly working on it, and most of them were doing various things. So they weren't, in some senses, consciously actually thinking of themselves doing Gulf studies. They were experts on this country or that country or this historical moment. So what I'm describing is that, once you get a kind of a mass of people working on this in North Atlantic world universities, they begin to articulate things that are pushing against, and I said, policy-oriented works on the Gulf. That's what I'm kind of juxtaposing. Having said that, when I make a point in my book about this, if you pick up a book or a journal from the 1970s and 1980s, what's interesting, actually, in most of those cases, the Gulf geographically is actually far more capacious. They will have chapters in Pakistan. They will always have chapters on Iran and Iraq, right? It's only with the GCC that the Gulf gets truncated and narrowed into this. So the older work from the late 70s and 80s, these edited volumes, do actually have a more capacious understanding. On your comment about the local historiographies, you're absolutely right, and it's true for Iraq or Basra as well as southern Iran. And yes, part of it they are trying to make some of them are making sort of nationalist claims that look, Bushehr has always been Iranian, or Basra has always been or tied to Baghdad, and Kuwait should be, and so forth. But they're also having a critique of the metropole, right? So that is also a critique of Tehran, a critique of Baghdad, a critique of Riyadh, and so forth. So I'm less able to make a kind of a comment on that, but you're right that there is, partly because of internet and so forth, there are quote unquote amateur historians that I follow on Instagram who do amazing work on some of these really small towns, and they document ships and homes and names, and they're actually very unapologetic about, you know, there was slavery, and these people, and they actually grapple with a racial, ethnic, religious diversity in ways that the metropole doesn't want to, just wants to ignore. They can't sidestep it because it's so obvious. From a student, Gabriel Young, who works on Basra, he also makes that point that the Basrawis also, there are these kind of amateur historians who are trying to document things, and when they do it, they actually grapple with whatever you want to call it, heterogeneity, hybridity, cosmopolitanism, and so forth. And that's all really welcome. And for your larger point, hopefully we'll have more of these conferences in ways that people can travel across borders easily and present and do research across borders. The other thing I didn't really talk about here is that we're not very good at talking about politics of research, field research, archival research. It's also a huge ordering process, right? Who gets access to what archives, what access to what countries, and so on. But there's a lot of work that should be done. And part of that should be, it's actually engagement with what I'm problematically calling amateur historians, local historians, which they are doing a lot. And yeah, follow Instagram accounts. It's a great way to actually see this happening. I suspect it's all over the world that's happening, but my small little place it's happening. We have time for one more. Okay.
So first of all, fascinating lecture. Thank you so much. But I just wanted to ask sort of about borders. I know you mentioned borders that have been on all of our minds recently. And I was really interested in how you talked about, you know, the Gulf being not just kind of a site for receiving theories from elsewhere, but for, you know, generating theories that might be, you know, productive within other contexts. So when talking about, you know, borders as embedded in society, not just like a line on a map between states, but really important in social relations more broadly, what do you think studies of, you know, borders in the Gulf have to offer to studies of borders as society in other places in the Middle East or other places, you know, around the world? You know, especially in a time like this when borders are so, you know, necessary to study. What do you think we can learn from studying the Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, there's and a lot of people in this room, again, and I think on Zoom, have really contributed to this. For the past, you know, 10, maybe even 15 years, there's been really a lot of great work on a very obvious and important topic of quote unquote migrant laborers, right? And that work continuously forces us to not study them, migrants, or in isolation, and think of how they are made vulnerable, deportable, and how that there's a process behind what we end up now calling the kafala system or the sponsorship system, right? And have us think about how it's tied to urban development, urban planning, and zoning, and what parts of the city are reserved for quote unquote bachelors and what parts are not. How even the real estate market is divided between property owners versus renters. And as I mentioned in the talk, how the process of rendering some people as merely as foreign was twinned and coupled with the process of defining who is Bahraini, who is Kuwaiti, who is Emirati, right? So you have to continuously read these processes as relational. So, you know, this is why I think when all the discussion we're having in the US about immigrants, migrants coming across the border, we're having it at the same time that people are having basic conversation, who is an American, right? And they're always two sides of the same coin. Who counts? You know, and our Canadians are Americans, I guess, is part of that story too, right? So I think that's just for me a very concrete example of how I've been thinking about the US, France in ways, new ways, partly thanks to this critical Gulf studies kind of work. Actually, and unfortunately, a lot of that work doesn't get used or adopted to look at Iran, for instance, but it's also helped me think about the discussions over the past 10, 15 years in the Iranian context and the battles over how to think of Afghans, how to think of children born to Iranian women, and actually the important political breakthroughs for these women and these children, right? These actually grappling with that we have to change our laws to accommodate a growing number of children who are born to non-Iranian fathers, and so there have been legal changes. But reading that the changes in Iran in relationship to what's been happening in the side of the Gulf, like that term, is also useful. So the other area I think Gulf studies has been very good is studies of urbanism. There's a lot to learn there as well. Urban design, the way people move through the cities is great.